Happy Friday afternoon, everyone. Welcome to PatristiCast. Today on I think this is my 12th episode or 11th episode. I forget which one. But I am extremely delighted to welcome Dr. Robert Louis Wilken, who is William R. Keenan Professor Emeritus of the History of Christianity at the University of Virginia. Now writes for First Things, if I'm not mistaken. He has many books published, including The First 1,000 Years, A Global History of Christianity in 2013. One of my favorite books, The Spirit of Early Christian Thought, Seeking the Face of God in 2003. And another classic, The Christians as the Romans Saw Them. First published in 1983 or 84, and then it was revised and republished in the early 2000s, I think 2003, somewhere around there. Dr. Wilkin, welcome to PatristiCast.
Happy to be here.
So we are here today to talk about what I think is your most recent book, Liberty in the Things of God, The Christian Origins of Religious Freedom. Now, I thought about inviting you on just because of your contributions to the field. And my first thought was to do The Spirit of Early Christian Thought, because I just like the book so much. But I thought this book, after I became aware of it and read it, I thought it not only is it informative, it's timely. And even though you don't stick to the patristic period, I think the conversation is still relevant and we can still talk quite a bit about the fathers as you do in your opening chapters. So I think even though you get into the Reformation, the early modern period quite a bit, it's still a great contribution to PatristiCast. I want to start with a quote from your introduction. It's kind of long, so please bear with me. Religious freedom rests on a simple truth. Religious faith is an inward disposition of the mind and heart, and for that reason cannot be coerced by external force. This truth was stated for the first time by Tertullian of Carthage, a Christian writer who lived in North Africa in the early 3rd century. And then a little bit you go on. To understand how religious freedom came to be cherished as a fundamental human right, the story must begin long before the Enlightenment and the development of modern political ideas and institutions, something that I think a lot of people assume. They start these conversations with the Enlightenment period. And its origins are not political, but religious. And its history is a tale of inwardness, of spiritual freedom, and of obeisance aimed upward. So religious freedom is not a political concept, it's a theological concept that informs how state and religion interact. Would that be an accurate kind of?
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
And it was curious that about the time the book appeared, there was an op-ed in the Washington Post by Kagan, I think. And he just assumed that religious freedom was a modern 18th and 19th century development. And what he was really talking about was toleration, which is a somewhat different concept. Toleration has to do with the willingness of political authorities to tolerate something that they don't like. And of course, will depend greatly on the political situation and well as the religious situation. Whereas religious freedom has to do with the basic human drive, understanding, and eventually right, namely that there is something inherent in human beings, and then which must be made possible within society, that people can live by their deepest convictions, their inner convictions, which of course will be religious cases. So that's really central to the argument of the book.
Yeah, underneath that, I think, is I'm getting some playback here. I don't know what's going on.
Let me turn off my phone. I don't know if that's the problem.
tolerance, as you say, is almost a grace given by the government to the people.
Correct.
Whereas a right, religious freedom, is something, to put it in the mindset of the framers of our Constitution, is something that pre-exists government.
Precisely, yes.
Yeah, your
And
book,
it's something that government acknowledges rather than grants.
like the freedom of speech, the
Right.
freedom to own property, that kind of thing. The book reminds me, a few years ago I read an essay in First Things, as a matter of fact, by a public intellectual, Yuval Levin, who takes up the issue of religious freedom in contemporary debates.
Right.
I think what got him going was the debates about religious freedom that arose from the Affordable Care Act. And
Correct.
How some people would say that religious freedom is something that's private. It's what you believe, and that can't be infringed, but it has nothing to do with actions. And one of the themes in your book is, no, that's not true at all. Actually, conscience informs actions. Therefore, religious freedom must include the freedom to worship publicly, the freedom to act out one's religion.
Yeah, a couple of points there. One of the things that I did discover was that Thomas Aquinas makes very clear that conscience has to do not with a conviction, but with an action.
Mm-hmm.
And he distinguishes it from other kinds of internal convictions. And I think that's very important. And it doesn't become apparent until really the 16th and the 17th century. What's somewhat ironic is that the early Christian notion of religious freedom, insofar as it was first enumerated, was really not developed until the 16th century, when Christians were persecuting Christians.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one thing. The second thing, what I discovered, is that religious freedom historically has to do primarily with the rights of communities. Of course, there are instances, many instances. The one that stands out is in the 17th century, the 16th century, with the execution of Servetus in Geneva. And there are other cases of that. But in fact, the reason why people discussed the matter and responded was because there were gatherings of people who were outside of the established practice of religion in a certain community. And that's why the Anabaptists in the 16th century really are, in a sense, the forerunners. Because what really bothered the religious leaders in all the cities was when you had people who would gather together to worship independently of what the majority of the people in the city were doing. And they would elect then their own leaders. And so the leaders of the religion of the community were alarmed, because that really disrupted the whole public order. Mm-hmm. So and that's something that's, I think, not generally recognized, that religious freedom historically has to do primarily with religious communities rather than individuals. So it certainly applies to individuals, but the disputes are about the status of communities, and that's the case today. The ones that come before the courts usually have to do with education and matters of that sort, where you have a religious community that is being discriminated against.
That was one of the themes that I found quite striking that runs throughout your book. There are some historians in the postmodern mindset who will somewhat shiver at narrative arcs in history. But I think the way you present the issue in your book is actually quite, there's something real to it, because in the early period, one of the earliest accusations against Christians is that they were illegal associations.
Right.
They were lumped in with the Bacchae, who were heavily persecuted in what, like the 2nd or 3rd century BC.
Sure.
They were suspected of plotting against the empire. And Christians then, because they were new and they were kind of secretive, they were lumped into that category. And you make the case about Tertullian, that in Tertullian's apology, and I think is it the Ad Scapulon?
Yes.
He does it. He's very explicit about it. It's not just the freedom of the individual conscience, but it's the community.
Right. And that comes through in the apology as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just not detected, I think, oftentimes, because people's mindset is so much set on the lonely heretic, the lonely dissenter,
mm-hmm.
and who is suppressed.
Mm-hmm. But in this early period, during the persecutions, it wasn't just individuals, but it was entire community. You got the exchange between Pliny and Trajan, was it?
Yes.
Pliny the Younger, and so he was there to interrogate an entire church, an entire community.
Yeah, it is about. And I mean, the other big example in the early centuries is Cyprian.
Yes.
And Cyprian, even though he comes up as an individual, it's not because he's an individual, it's because he's the head of the Catholic community in Carthage. And you go down one issue after another, and you'll see that it has to do with the behavior of communities, dissenting communities.
And have historical circumstances changed? So after Constantine and the Edict of Milan, or sometimes called the Edict of Toleration, and then later.
You're not supposed to call it the Edict of Milan anymore. No, Timothy Barnes. It's a letter, and he gets quite irate. And so if you call it the Edict of Milan and he's still around and reads you, you're going to get blasted.
Yes, that's right. The Protocols of Milan, is that what you call it in your book?
Yeah, that's a phrase that I got from Harold Drake, a historian at University, Southern California, I think it is.
Okay.
And I think that's, so it's just a way to try to avoid Timothy's wrath.
So let's do that. Let's avoid Timothy's wrath here. So it's a letter, but it changes the course of history, and then at the end of the 4th century, roughly, Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire, and that drastically changes. And then,
but I don't think. I mean, I would not put it that way. I don't think that the Edict or the Protocols of Milan did change the course of history. It was significant in its own time, and had a big impact on the communities then. But it was basically forgotten. As I observed at some point, it doesn't. When you read the histories of the period written by Christians, say at the end of the 4th century, Socrates and Sodzomen and so forth, they don't say anything about it, and nobody cites it. It's not really until the Reformation, and even not so much in the Reformation. It's not until the 17th century that you get people invoking it. It's significant, but it's not one that really had a long life in terms of its being appealed to.
That's true. And in your book, you make the case. You point out. You don't make the case. You point out that even Augustine, when he's writing The City of God, almost a century after Constantine, that Christians were still having to defend themselves against non-Christian polemic. But roughly in the Middle Ages, there's a Christendom emerges, and relationships between Christianity and the empire change, and that starts to have effects in the Reformation period, as you rightly point out here, where there's a question. You ask a question, or you cite somebody who's asking a question, and I thought it very striking. The question is, I think this is a French person who asked, would you ever have thought in your youth that you would see something so extraordinary that 2 different religions would be practiced in the same city, and even in the capital of France? And I thought that's such a profound question, and it has you think about how these individuals, I mean, there were groups, Jan Hus, for example, and the Cathars and this and that. For the most part, Western Europe was a monolithic religious culture. And then all of a sudden in the 16th century, that drastically changes and they're confronted with a new reality.
That's the historical circumstances that make it possible. And I was just thrilled when I ran across that passage. In a way, France is exceptional, because here you had a country that really was unified and at every level. Mm-hmm. And but then the Calvinists started to make their way. Mm-hmm. And in a short time, they became a significant minority. So here is someone who's living in France, and he's seeing it unfold before him. Mm-hmm. And here people are gathering to worship, but they're not following the historic, inherited, traditional patterns. Mm-hmm. And that was very troubling, very troubling. And so in France, then, it really becomes a major issue, is how to deal with these people. And one of the things that was, for me, most stimulating about writing this book is that I read so many people who I had never heard of before.
That's one of the things. That's one of the great things about reading this book.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know any of these people. Michel de l'Hôpital. Who knows about Michel de l'Hôpital?
Now, I have to tell you, I was very pleased, and I'm going to tell my undergraduate supervisor about this, because she wrote her dissertation on de l'Hôpital. So I'm going to let her know about this. She'll be delighted.
Yeah, well, tell her. And I picked up a reference here or a reference there, and we only live about 5 minutes from the Library of Congress.
Yeah.
And so I did a lot of the work over there. And of course, everything is there. So I was able to go back and to find these 16th century documents that were accounts of the meeting of the Estate General of the Estates in France, and to find the quote and to read it into context. So he was one of the people. Another one of the discoveries, and he's not so for many theologians, is John Owen, the 17th century Congregationalist writer, who I had never read. And he's remarkable. And he, well, I describe it in the book, he actually preached a sermon after the execution of Charles II. Mm-hmm. And then he wrote an essay on toleration, which he appended to the sermon when it was published. And he knew all of the key texts from the early church, and he cites them in Latin.
Yep.
Now, we're losing one man, though I must advise you that he's very long-winded, very long-winded. But he was very, very learned, and he saw a lot of things that about the tradition on the matter of religious freedom that others did not see.
Well, much like John Owen, and you have a nice little autobiographical moment, maybe in your epilogue, Thomas Jefferson and Tertullian, two names I never thought I'd see put together. But you say you were in the Library of Congress, was it? And you were reading Thomas Jefferson, and here he's got an X by a passage in Tertullian.
Well, that was probably the most exciting moment. It's the kind of thing you spend your whole life and never think it's going to happen. I knew that he knew the passage from Tertullian that you quoted at the beginning. And in the University of Virginia Rare Book Library, there is his personal copy of the notes on the state of Virginia, written probably 1780, around in there. Mm-hmm. And so I went to the library and got the book and brought it up. And sure enough, on the page where he says that what a person thinks cannot harm somebody else. If you pick my pocket, that hurts me. But you can't hurt me with just words, religious words.
Right.
And that's precisely what Tertullian said. And at the bottom of the page, he had written out in Latin the couple of sentences from Tertullian's Ad Scapulum. I thought to myself, that's crazy. I mean, really. So I took myself over to the Library of Congress. I knew that he had some Tertullian in his library, called the book up and opened it and turned to Ad Scopulum, and I'll be darned if he had not underlined the passage, put a big X in the margin. So that's the kind of thing you spend your life looking for. And so anyway, so now the only thing is that I could not establish that he knew that citation when he wrote the Notes on the State of Virginia, in which he discusses religious freedom. And it was to my disappointment, actually, I wrote several of the best Jefferson scholars in the United States, and no one had a clue. And what was even more distressing, no one cared. It just wasn't a big thing as far as they were concerned. So that's why I put it in an appendix. Didn't want to try to overstate what I had found, and just to say that clearly he knew this text at a certain point, probably 1810, 1815, when he bought the book, but it wasn't there when he was writing his thoughts, but it could be.
And I think you say in here that we can't tell if he read a lot of Tertullian, but it could be more like that he knew what he was looking for, and when he found it, he marked it.
I don't think he'd read a lot of Tertullian. I think that's very, very unlikely. I think that he read widely, and my own respect for him actually grew as I worked on this project. But I think that what happened was I suspect that the citation was being passed on among Baptist preachers who had become active in Virginia in the 18th century. There is, in fact, I discussed that in a little appendix. Madison, who lived, of course, he was close to Jefferson, but he lived close by and in Orange County. And Madison actually attended a revival in the countryside there. And he even writes about a couple of preachers who had been imprisoned in Culpeper, a little town in Virginia, on the question of descending from Anglicanism, which was the religion of the colony. So that's my guess is where he first, because it was the quotation had been passed around in a lot of, Roger Williams knew it, as I indicated, John Owens knew it. And I think Locke might have known it, but I wasn't able to establish that he did know it. What he says seems to reflect the sentiments that are present in Tertullian. So it is, I think, known widely, or was known widely.
So there are, particularly at the very beginning, three key themes in the book. And I'm going to start with the third, but I'll read them out right now to begin with. So the one is that religious belief is an inner conviction accountable to God alone and resistant to compulsion. 2, conscience is a form of spiritual knowledge that carries an obligation to act. And 3, human society is governed by 2 powers. So I thought maybe talk a little bit about the 2 powers, because that's a theme that runs throughout the entire book, the relationship between church and state.
Right. Well, as I've said to a number of friends, the deeper I got into this, and the more my line of thinking was being forged, the more I began to have something of a guilty conscience about the 2 powers. I mean, there are 2 powers, clearly, but to drive such a hard line between the 2, as though political authority has nothing to do with religion, I think really does not understand or does not grasp the way the 2 are related. But I didn't want to give up on the argument, because it was very important that I drive home the argument to its extent. And so I felt if I would have started stepping back and saying, well, now this is kind of a problem. And the way in which Locke puts it is too extreme. And that's what's picked up by Madison and Jefferson. It would have forced me really to write a different kind of book and to sort of make a case about religious freedom and the political order that I was not able to do. Yeah. I mean, wasn't really in a position to do. And so I just kind of stood up and said, okay, I'm going to do what I can do and recognize that there are some limitations in overdoing this distinction. So it's fundamental, no question about that.
Well, isn't that just, just occurred to me, isn't that what First Things tries to do? Is it tries to discuss this issue of the relationship between religion and the public square?
That's true. But you mentioned that I write for First Things, and I was chairman of the board of the Religion and Public Life, the institute that publishes First Things. But I have never written on political matters, except in a historical sense, and do not myself participate in these discussions, even though, because I was with the First Things, I was part of all kind of discussions. And so it really was not my task, nor do I think I could have done it well, because I just didn't have the depth of it. Because the question then comes, then you immediately have to get into legal history.
Yes.
And once you get into legal history, I would have had to make an argument as to why religious freedom is primarily about religious communities. And that's not well documented in the legal tradition. And so there are others. So it was a question of modesty and my own limitations that I wanted to make a case that I felt could stand, and it has stood. I mean, there's been no fundamental criticism of the argument. I mean, but I did sort of step back in my own mind and not. I mean, there are a number of other ways that the book could have gone. I thought for a time of getting into modern Catholic history and going into the 19th century and then leading up to Vatican II and what a revolution that was. It's document on religious freedom. But that would have made me write a completely different book. Yeah. And also, when I was writing this book, I was really kind of the end of my academic intellectual life. I mean, I didn't want to really take on more than I could handle. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, it's true when you bring it out in your book that for the writers you're dealing with, the two powers was a real thing. And that's something that they really tried to grapple with. And
yes, and it is fundamental to the whole history of Western civilization and of Christianity. And in some ways, John Calvin was the clearest. But he's a good example. John Calvin says there are two realms, yet when it comes to Servetus, the one realm has control of the other realm. So he's not very consistent on that. Yeah. And even Luther said, that there should be only one kind of preaching in a territory.
Well, that gets to the Augsburg. The Augsburg Confession, where it's the religion of the prince is the religion of the people.
Yes, well, that was a traditional view.
As one solution to this problem of these emerging different religious communities emerging in the state and how to deal with it. There was something striking because doing historical theology, I always kind of perk up when people talk theology, and there was a place in here, I tried to find it before our talk, but I couldn't find it anywhere. But regarding the two powers, you had made the point that some rulers used the Old Testament kings as types for their own rulership. So yes. With typology, and I thought to myself, Origen would love this, because what's implied in your argument there is that that's a false typology. That historical event or person is not a type of another future event or person. I thought that's exactly what Origin says.
Well, that's a very important point. It comes out in the debate between Roger Williams and John Cotton. And John Cotton and others who were in positions of leadership, political leadership as well as religious leadership, used typology, which meant to take an event from the Old Testament, in this case, the authority of kings, and then to apply that to their own time. And what Roger Williams saw and understood was that that's not how typology works. Typology means that something which had a quote unquote material historical significance in one epoch, in another epoch has a spiritual significance. And the classic biblical text on that is in 1 Corinthians 10, where Paul says, that the going through the Red Sea is like baptism.
Yep.
So it's not like going through another sea. And so you can't say that kings have that sort of authority now. And I think that's pretty irrefutable. It's a misuse of typology.
And Origin takes to task people who use the Exodus Passover as a type for the Passion in his treatise on the Passover, or Peripashka. And he says, the biblical Exodus is a type of the passing over from death to new life that we Christians live every day.
Right.
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting point, but you could certainly see how certain people would exploit the Old Testament rulers to justify their own rulership. And so it makes sense that they're dealing with it.
Well, that's the whole history of the medieval world. I mean, and one of the things that I discovered, actually, I had a student write a dissertation on medieval, basically early medieval commentaries on the historical books about the kings. And what you find is that in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th century, what they did is they took those and read them in terms of their own political situation, not in terms of primarily spiritual. So it was a kind of misuse of typology.
You talked about religious freedom applying to communities. And that's something that comes out particularly in the English Reformation, where you don't, you do have different religions under one nation, but you have, it's quite different than in the continent, because in England, they don't replace a corporate church, the Catholic Church, for example, with different confessional communities. They replace it with another corporate church, being the Church of England. And so then how did they deal with the dissenters within that? Not just Catholics, but there was the one, I'm forgetting his name off the top of my head, but he came to the logical conclusion that religious freedom applies not just to different Christian groups, but to Jews and Muslims as well, who are living in the empire.
It was Thomas Helwys, Helwys, and he was a real discovery for me. I gave a talk at Georgetown at the Religious Freedom Institute over there. And when I was early working on this, and there was a guy in the audience named Joseph Trigg. Joseph Trigg is
the one who translated Origin.
This is another Trigg. It's a Trigg, British scholar. And he said, you ought to look at Thomas Helwys. Well, of course, I went and looked at Thomas Helwys. And Thomas Helwys was really the most radical of all. And he said precisely that, even though he hated the Catholics. I mean, he hated the Anglicans, but he hated the Catholics, but he saw right through. And so I was very glad to be able to make that point, to indicate that this isn't just an inner Western Christian kind of thing, but that once you buy into the notion that religious freedom is a fundamental human right, well, then you've got got to extend it to the Muslims and the Jews, and he did. And the book is, you can read it in English. It's not too long, and he's not a deep thinker, but he saw things clearly.
Yeah,
and
he took it to its logical.
It was one of those discoveries. What?
He took it to its logical conclusion.
He did, exactly. Yeah, and that's why I mentioned him in the conclusion.
And the other tension that they seem to be dealing with is, okay, so if the state has to stay out of religious affairs, if their power does not extend to the religious sphere, their power is limited to the safety and the well-being of the polis, what then happens when religious practice becomes a threat to the society? And it seems like some of them wanted to keep some power or some role for the government in religious affairs. They didn't want to quite go all the way to say you have to stay out of it.
Yeah, well, and I think that's true. That's the issue that I realized I was basically dodging as to what the consequences of that would be. And the main area is in education. Once you have a society and you start talking about education, then the role of the state and the role of the religious community are going to have to find a way to work together. And so you can't draw such a clean line. I mean, we know that in this country, and we've been fighting about it, now for most of the 20th century. And we'll continue to fight about it. I think European societies have actually come to terms with it earlier by just simply saying that there are going to be these religious schools, and they're going to be government schools, but not here. So you just can't follow through the logic of the strong distinction that you get in John Locke.
Right.
And I think John Locke is actually using the language of Roger Williams, even though I could not establish that he had read Williams.
The language was in the air at any rate. So
well, he knew John Owen. He was in school with John Owen, and I think he probably had read his essay on toleration. But John Owen is the same way. John Owen makes the distinction, drives it home, but yet then he realizes that he can't follow it through consistently. And I think that it shows that he understood that there was more involved here than simply a clear-cut distinction between religion and government and politics.
One of the things that emerges in your book is that some of these thinkers rely on legal arguments or political philosophy. Others rely on theological arguments, which brings me to I want to get there. I will get there before we end because I think it's an important conversation to have on points 1 and 2, where religious belief is an inner conviction, but then also it carries an obligation to act. Talk about Aquinas. But before I do that, you've mentioned some figures that really emerge to you as kind of a pleasant discoveries. One of them in here was Caritas Pirkheimer.
Oh, yes. She's a heroic figure, yes.
Yeah, she is. Can you talk a little bit about her? She was great.
Well, yeah. Here you are in Nuremberg in the 1520s. She is the abbess of a Franciscan community that's been there for hundreds of years. And overnight, the city fathers decide to embrace Lutheranism. So they then proceed to transform the religious life in the city. And so they come into her community and say, you've got to stop doing this, you've got to stop doing this, and we're not going to allow you to do that, we're not going to allow you to do that. And of course, the sisters are irate, they're angry, and they don't understand what's going on. And so what she does is she kept a journal and she wrote what happened sort of week by week and month by month, how they forced them not to pray in the choir as they had, forced them to get rid of their habits, sent in Lutheran preachers to preach to those poor sisters, and what they did is they put cotton in their ears so they wouldn't have to listen.
That's right.
I mean, it's a beautiful text. It's short. It's in English. You can read it, and but there were two things in there. One is that she appeals to conscience as the reason why they don't have to bow to the secular authorities. And what I say is that basically that indicates that conscience was a medieval Christian idea, not something that came about in the Reformation, which is a lot of historians will say. And Luther makes the same appeal to conscience, that he's going to follow his conscience rather than what the religious authority want him to follow. And so the point being is that she represents, as a religious sister, a tradition that goes back in the Middle Ages, which is precisely what all the Protestants were relying on. So it really is probably the most powerful proof that we're not dealing with something that came about in the Reformation, which is the kind of thing you get from a lot of historical works. But the second thing is, she reminds the political religious authorities that in temporal matters, they're happy to obey, but on religious matters. So basically, she assumes that there are two realms, there are two authorities. So the Pirkheimer book, for me, again, was one of the great discoveries. And I just, her courage, you know, she wrote very well and clearly, and she wasn't unique. There was a, okay, good. Anyway, so she was another discovery. I mean, I did about 3 or 4 people I had never really read. And of course, I had never read Locke to that degree. I mean, everybody's read Locke at some point, but to really dig into Locke, that for me was a challenge. I read some of the literature on Locke. But as you well know, and it's something that you learn, the only way to go is to read the original sources. If you read the original, I used to tell my graduate students, you know, so when you go out and give a learned paper at a society, and even if there's somebody out there who knows a lot more about the topic than you do, if you have read the sources and you're basing your judgments on what you have read, you have nothing to worry about. But if you read some stupid book and are quoting that, you're liable to just be made a fool of. So it was just a question of having read these things. I read a lot of Locke during that. I mean, I read through a lot of his other works just to be sure. And actually, I began to wonder, why were people so hostile to Locke today? And a lot of my conservative friends, I kind of liked a lot of things about him.
Well,
and by the way, let me just say that there's another figure in here that I discovered, which I realized no one had read. He was the link between Locke and James Madison. Let's see what his name is here. Philip.
Yeah.
And I found that nobody had read Furneaux.
I'd never heard of him.
And everything that's in Locke on this issue comes from Furneaux. No one knew Furneaux. I mean, I was amazed. Again, it's just a matter of following the leads. And Furneaux kind of laid it all out. That's why I had a little section on the end.
It just goes to show you don't write a book because you know the subject. You write a book, you learn about the subject as you write the book.
Of course. That's true.
So I want to talk a little theology because you're very, one of the fundamental insights is that conscience is not, it's not just about intellectual assent, but you work with Aquinas, and conscience is actually an act. So it informs our actions, so that if you impede conscience, you're actually impeding somebody's right to act morally. And that kind of goes back to Tertullian, you say, because Tertullian is dealing with very similar language. How did you put it? Freedom for Tertullian. This is in one of your earliest chapters. Freedom for Tertullian implies that each person is a moral agent, able to act based on beliefs. This self-governing domain, therefore, must be respected. Now, of course, it's not just the individual, but it's also the community who's engaging in these acts. And you talk a little bit about the roots of the word conscience, conscientia, so with knowledge. Talk a little bit about that, because that's, I think, an important point that we need to make when we talk about conscience and freedom of conscience.
Yes, well, the term conscientia, or syneides, is same thing in Greek. Basically, prior to Christianity, had more to do with a form of knowledge. And by the addition of the term con, or sin, it means that it's knowledge that is not just private, it's knowledge that is shareable, because it's other people who know about it. And so if you read Seneca, his moral epistles, you'll see that he uses it in terms of those things that you are conscious that you have done. And if those things are worthy, then of course you have a good conscience. And if they're unworthy, then you have a bad conscience. And that runs through a lot of writers, and it's present in the New Testament, most notably in Romans 2, where Paul uses the term precisely in that sense. But then there are some other passages in the New Testament where it has, rather than a retroactive view of what has gone before, it begins to take overtones of what should be the case in the future, which is really the basis of the later and our modern understanding of conscience. And so I quote a passage from Origen in which he says, that both meanings, but it's clear that the meaning of retrospect or prospective is where the tradition is heading. And that's how it then comes to be used later on, and is used today. Conscience is seldom used about what has happened in the past. It has to do with what you should or shouldn't do. So it carries moral overtones.
Yeah, well, you say, so the Greek, on the one hand, you used synesis, right? That's the Greek word for conscience. But there's also the Greek expression that comes from Stoicism, what is in our control, the to ephemen. So these are two interrelated terms that have to do with.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the basic term for free will.
Right.
Epiphemen. And so that's undergirds then what conscience is about. It's what one has control of. So there is no real word for free will in Greek. Later you get autoexousios, autoexousios, but
that's like self-control or self-authority kind of thing, self-determination.
Right. So so it's close. Those are verb related, and I think I discussed it. And of course, then there was the biblical side. This morning, on Friday in morning prayer, you always pray. I always pray Psalm 51. And what is it God desires is not a sacrifice, but a pure and contrite heart. So that's where the inwardness comes from.
Right.
And the inwardness then has to do with, in this case, with freedom, the freedom to act on the basis of what one knows and believes.
Yeah, and for Origen, particularly, with whom I'm more familiar than Tertullian, the biblical concept heart does have intellectual and moral connotations, because that is synonymous with the Greek hegemonikon, which is the moral processing center of the soul, the intellect, where information is processed and then the choice is made to act this way or that. So,
and I think in the New Testament, and I think in the Psalms, I think heart has intellectual overtones. It's not simply effective.
that's right. That's right. Well, there's, I forget where, but in the new homilies on the Psalms that we talked about earlier, in his second homily on Psalm 15, he uses the heart in this way, and he's assuming that the biblical authors are using it in the same way too, as an intellectual faculty. And I think it's in one of his homilies on Jeremiah where God tests the hearts and kidneys. I think it's the hearts and kidneys that God tests. And so Origen is thinking that the biblical authors are not using heart in just this affective sense of emotions and feelings.
I think that's a very important point to make. I think it takes something out of heart. If you, there's one passage in Psalm 119 is about the heart guiding our actions. You don't expect that to be the case, but that's what that means. It's partly, well, it's intellectual, it's cognitive.
And for Origen and Tertullian and Clement, for the early Christians then, because this, whether it's the heart or the conscience, however you want to put it, is the center of our moral self, if human beings are forced through compulsion to act in a certain way, then they're not responsible for their actions. And for Origen, and I would presume Tertullian as well, that's a very dangerous proposition. I think you put it here. Tertullian, because Tertullian was trained in law. He was a lawyer, but you say that his case is moral and theological, not legal. Christian thinkers defended freedom of choice as essential to the moral life. Without the ability to choose, an agent cannot be responsible for his acts.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And actually, as much as I admire Origen, I have to say that I do think that Tertullian is somehow not really appreciated. And you read through his writings, on these and other points. So he's a theologian as well, and I think they overdo the law thing, and on that particular point. And actually, one of the early difficulties I had was how to translate the passage from Ad Scapulum 2, because in Latin it would come out if you just translated it straightforwardly. I have it here. Where is it now? Oh, no, I have it there. Anyway, it has down towards the back here. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, it's tamen humani juris. That would be a human right.
Yes.
And then naturalis potestas. If you translate, nevertheless, the human right and natural power, it just doesn't convey what he's talking about. And I really struggled over that for months, and had some correspondence with a prof at Harvard Law School who had written on, I guess, jus in Roman authors. He had not seen the Tertullian passage. And I realized, and so I came up with my translation. How do I put it then? It is only just and a privilege inherent in human nature. One of the things as a graduate instructor that I, late in my years, was to try to get people to learn how to translate into English. rather than this kind of mechanical translating that you get in school, and then you get also in a lot of graduate school where people don't really know the language that well, and keep telling them that the most important thing about a translation is the language you're translating into, because that's what people. So I was very pleased with what I came up with.
Well, you also right after that, because you talk about that in page 13 and 14, the issue with the translation of these terms. But you carry the theological argument even further, and you say that it's really rooted for Tertullian in his notion that human beings are made in the image of God. And so it is within their power to resist paying homage to gods who are not gods. So compelling religious behavior through force or coercion is really depriving the human individual of their inherent dignity, is what you're saying.
Right, exactly. I mean, and the image of God, of course, is at, as you rightly point out, is at the base of the whole understanding. And that there are few phrases, biblical phrases, that have such power in the whole tradition as being made in the image of God. And it just works in so many different directions.
That's right. That's right. Okay, so well, we've been going on for about an hour here, so I thought maybe we would wrap up. And as I was saying, I was hoping, I'm doing something new. This is the first time I'm doing it. So you should feel very honored. But I want to end with a quote. And so if you could read, starting on the last paragraph on page 182, and then go to the end of 180.
All right, okay. Yeah, so I wind up quoting Herman Butterfield, the English historian, who once argued that toleration of different forms of Christianity arose out of the exhaustion brought about by the conflicts of the Reformation era. Only when it was evident that there could be no settlement of religious differences did the possibility of political solutions come into view. This gets things backward. Any account of the rise of religious freedom must give a large place to the spiritual passion and intellectual energy of Christians. Men and women of faith knew, as Tertullian had written in the 3rd century, that religion cannot be imposed from without. The events of the 16th and the 17th centuries were a catechesis on the nature of faith. God can be honored only if one gives something from within. That conviction, embodied in the lives of those who were persecuted and given voice in the writings of their champions, taught others there could be no justice in society without liberty in the things of God.
Wonderful.
Very true today.
Absolutely.
And more so in your country.
Oh, hey, I'm American. I'm just up here in Canada for the school.
Oh, I see.
I'm from
Minnesota. I mean,
Minnesota.
some of the things I've read about recently about going into churches, especially out west in Canada, and telling them to stop.
Alberta, yeah, I think that was Alberta. Yeah. Well,
So you're not a Canadian. I thought you were maybe Canadian.
No, I'm from Minnesota.
Where in Minnesota?
Alexandria, as a matter of fact. Not Egypt, but Minnesota.
I see.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, Dr. Wilkin, thank you very much for joining PatristiCast today. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure.